When people hear the word Renaissance, usually the first word that they associate with that is art, because Renaissance art is going to be a radical change in artistic style from the medieval Gothic style. But artists respond to their culture. They're either rebelling against trends in their culture or they're reinforcing trends in their culture. And there's something going on in the culture called humanism. In fact, humanism is the characteristic intellectual movement of the Renaissance. It's an intellectual and cultural program based on the study of ancient Greek and Roman literature. It begins in philosophy and education in the Italian city-state of Florence. Its aim was to replace the scholastic emphasis on logic and metaphysics with the study of language, literature, rhetoric, history, and ethics. Why did this start in Florence, in Italy? Well, for one thing, Italy was a wealthy urban culture. Members of the clergy were not likely to dominate government and education in Italy. Rather, education more likely was supervised by town governments to provide training in accounting, arithmetic, and the composition of business letters. So the political roots started in Italy because it was a land of wealth and cities. Rome, Milan, Florence, Venice, Mantua, Ferrara, Padua, Bologna, Genoa were all different from the rest of Europe. They were cities with wealth as opposed to feudalized agriculture of the north. In fact, by the late 11th and 12th centuries, there was a flourishing commercial and banking culture there. Its geography made it a natural gateway between the East and West also. In fact, by 1300, nearly all of north and central Italy was owned by profit-seeking urban capitalists who produced for city markets. So, it was not dominated by the feudal nobility. Feudal nobles moved to cities and the aristocracy had to share power with rich merchants. Another reason, besides this flourishing commercial and banking that was going on in Italy, is the fact that the ruins of the great classical Roman civilization were everywhere. Roads, monuments, manuscripts were all over Italy. So that's going to contribute also to this looking back toward the past of the great Greco-Roman culture. We see these changes creating a Renaissance society. The new wealth of middle class resulted in new values. For instance, the feudal values were birth, military prowess, and a fixed hierarchy of lords and vassals. In other words, your future basically depended on what family you were born into, who your father was. But in the cities, ambition and individual achievement are what count. There's a new urban society with commercial oligarchies. Now, this is going to result in an altered family life. For instance, marriage. Liability in the city was basically caused by the guy had to make a fortune, and if you married early, trying to take care of your family limited your ability to use all your resources to build up your business. So you have a lot of old guys marrying young girls. And since guys are getting married a lot later in life, you also have a lot of sexual activity, like homosexuality, prostitution, triangles involving an old man and a young wife and her lover. There's also new patrons of the art. Rulers and rich merchants, because nobles looked at culture to display their political and social importance, would be the rule of the day. Support for humanists and artists in the Renaissance came principally, in other words, from guilds and religious brotherhoods, the state, the wealthy families, and oligarchs. Because of banking, international trade, and even service as mercenaries, Italians, and particularly Florentines, had money to spend on arts and luxuries. Thus, the Italians of the Renaissance, whether as public or private patrons, could afford to use the consumption of art as a form of competition for social and political status. The first burst of artistic creativity in the 14th century was paid for by public institutions. Communal governments built city halls to house government and to promote civic pride. These buildings contained the jail, the mint, law courts, assembly rooms, and even living quarters for administrators. Towns also reorganized streets, public squares, and the myriad hospitals and lodgings for travelers that dotted the city. In most towns, there was a remarkable emphasis on the beauty of the work. In Florence, public art was often organized and paid for by various guild organizations. Guild membership was a prerequisite for citizenship, so guildsmen set the tone in politics as well as in the commercial life of the city. By the mid-15th century, patrons of artworks in Florence and most other regions of Italy were more likely to be wealthy individuals. Palaces, gardens, and villas became the settings in which the wealthy could entertain their peers, receive clients, and debate the social and political issues of the day. The public rooms of these palaces were decorated with portraits, gem collections, books, ceramics, statuary. Isn't that the case today? Rich people collect stuff. Have you ever seen Jay Leno's collection of cars? Other rich people collect art, collect statues, or collect stamps. I went to this one guy's house, and he invited me into his bedroom, and he opened this big safe door, and there were tons of Civil War materials in there. I mean, guns and uniforms and all kinds of Civil War artifacts. They should have been in a museum. And the public rooms of these palaces they're building are decorated with all this stuff, with gem collections, books, ceramics, statuary. Many villas and palaces even included private chapels. Now, Cosimo de' Medici said his great works were for his own remembrance. In fact, he began the first public library since antiquity. Two words pretty well characterize this new Renaissance society: secularism and individualism. For one thing, there's a growing secular outlook, the result of wanting to enjoy worldly pleasures their new wealth could buy. So, the busy life of the cities, the new possibilities for the enjoyment of life, and for the satisfaction of aesthetic tastes, of intellectual curiosity, provided by luxury, wealth, and leisure, all tended to thrust the thoughts of religion and the future world farther into the background of men's minds. And then there was a growing individualism. Urban life and wealth freed them from the constraints of the manor and church. They desired to assert their own personalities, discuss and express their emotions, and win fame and glory. Now, this is obviously limited to the elite, and the poor are going to live like they always did for a long time, but this is a definite change in this Renaissance society. So where did this new outlook on life start that's going to affect all the arts and architecture and the whole concept of living? Well, in the universities. There's a new professor and a new field of studies, the Faculty of Humane Letters. In other words, the faculty now are going to value ancient literature for its own sake. Literae Humaniores, the study of language, literature, history, and philosophy for its own end, instead of just to support the scriptures like the Faculty of Divine Letters of the medieval period. They studied the scriptures, and the study of classical literature was only to support the scriptures. So the bond that knit humans together was a commitment to study classical texts for their own sake rather than as handmaidens to Christian theology. The goal of human studies was to be wise and to speak eloquently, both to know what is good and to practice virtue. Learning was not to remain abstract and unpracticed. It is better to will the good than to know the truth, Petrarch had taught, and this became the motto of many later humanists. In fact, the first humanists were orators and poets. The Florentine Leonardo Bruni first gave the name humanitas, humanity, to the learning that resulted from such scholarly pursuits. By humanism, Italians meant rhetoric and literature, the arts of persuasion, not an ideological or moral curriculum based on religious assumptions about human nature. Poetry, history, letter writing, and oratory, based on forms of aesthetic values consciously borrowed from ancient Greece and Rome, were at the center of this new intellectual life. Now, what were the ideals of Renaissance humanists? Writers and artists themselves were aware of their age's novelty. They looked at the Middle Ages as the Dark Age and revived some positive ideals from antiquity. For instance, they're going to stress this life rather than the next life, like the Middle Ages. Second, they valued the full development of human talent, the ideal of the Renaissance man, the l'uomo universale in Italian, the universal man, the complete man, which entailed the advancement of the mind, perfection of the body, cultivation of social graces, appreciation and creativity in the arts. Finally, the humanists generally espoused two basic ideals: reverence for the full scope of pagan as well as Christian antiquity, and belief in the distinctiveness of the individual, in contrast to the medieval tendency to seek virtue through monastic life and spiritual solitude. The humanists sought virtue in the public square. They had the desire to make a difference in their society as individuals. Now, there were some negative consequences of some of this focus on oneself and individuality. For instance, this emphasis on individual sometimes led to lawlessness and political factionalism and amoral attitudes. I think a prime example of this excess is Benvenuto Cellini, who in his autobiography reports that he was a Florentine who was a brilliant goldsmith and sculptor. His bronze sculpture here, Perseus with the head of Medusa, is one of my favorite sculptures from the whole period of the Renaissance. But he brags about his talent, his love for life, and his propensity for violence. I mean, he fathered 8 legitimate and illegitimate children. He was banished from Florence for sodomy. He was imprisoned for assault. He fled to Rome after murdering a man. So he's not exactly representing the ideal, virtuous Renaissance man. On the other hand, there were some important humanists that I think you should be aware of. Now let's look at some important humanists who do display the kind of character that we can all admire. One of my favorite intellectual heroes is Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, whose dates are 1304 to 1374. He was born in Arezzo, a small town outside Florence, and is considered to be the father of Italian humanism. He saw the Middle Ages as irrelevant and corrupt. He was dismayed by the intellectual, spiritual, and moral leadership of his own times, particularly in the church, and instead looked for guidance to the ancient world of Greece and Rome. The ancients, he and his fellows believed, possessed true virtue. If we want to be good, they argued, all of him and his contemporaries, these early humanists, we should imitate them. In fact, he coined the terms Babylonian captivity and Dark Ages. He was repelled by the urban violence and wars he had experienced, and he was highly critical of his contemporaries. Petrarch once confessed, "I never liked this age." He believed that the study and memorization of the writings of classical authors could lead to an internalization of the ideals and values expressed in those works. In fact, Petrarch gave the original impetus to the revival of classical scholarship in modern times. Before Petrarch, there was no humanism. In attempts to restore the texts he loved, he led the way to the revival of textual criticism. He didn't long, however, for the logic and metaphysics or natural sciences offered by the Aristotelian revival of the later scholastic philosophy, but for knowledge of the human soul and human values. In fact, his emphasis on ethics is probably a reaction against the Babylonian captivity of the church. In the end, nearly all the classical Latin texts known in his time had been collected, read, and more or less fully annotated in their margins by Petrarch himself. In other words, he was the first man of letters in modern times to build up a private library of this kind. Petrarch thought of the new era mainly as a revival of classics limited to the restoration of Latin and Greek to their former purity and a return to the original text of the ancient authors. In fact, he rebelled against his father's desire for him to be a lawyer by reading Virgil and Cicero. He studied law, but quite after his father's death, he quit after his father's death, and he wandered around most of his life looking for ancient texts. He was also a courtier and a diplomat, but he had an insatiable and curious mind that searched out and copied ancient classical texts that had remained hidden and unread in various monasteries in Europe. Now let's talk about his works. One true mark of the Renaissance sensibility was the keen interest in the self and an increased thirst for personal glory and fame. He wrote a work called Secretum Meum, My Secret, in 1343. It basically consists of his imaginary dialogues with Augustine. He talks about his moral, intellectual failings, his besetting sins, and his tendency to fall into fits of depression. He agrees with hero Augustine that he should be less concerned with his intellectual labors and the fame that derives from them and concern himself more with salvation and the spiritual perfection of his life. So he's kind of caught between his old study of scriptures and activity in church and his new perspective on what's important that he's getting from the Renaissance revival of these ancient works. So he lived in a sort of a state of ambivalence. In fact, he said, "I will be true to myself as far as it is possible. I will pull myself together and collect my scattered wits and make a great endeavor to possess my soul in patience. But even while we speak, a crowd of important affairs, though only of this world, is waiting for my attention." Another important work he wrote was Letter to Posterity in 1373, just a year before his death. It's basically his autobiography where he reviews his life up to 1351. It's unfinished. But it is a clear testimony to his thirst for learning, fame, and self-awareness. It's an important primary document of the sensibility of the 14th century Proto-Renaissance. Another work he wrote was the Canzoniere, and this is his best-known work. It's a songbook. More than 300 sonnets and 49 canzoni, songs written in Italian. Sonnets dealing with his love for Laura divided into two groups, those written in her lifetime and those mourning her death from the plague of 1348. They were lovers, but she was married. She was no literary abstraction, no symbol without earthly reality like Dante's Beatrice. She was a flesh and blood woman whom Petrarch loved deeply. And he wrote another work that he thought was going to really make him reach the level of Virgil's Aeneid. It's called Africa, a Latin epic in the style of the Aeneid to honor the Roman general Scipio Africanus. He seemed to have a sense of his eventual status as a precursor of a new age, the Renaissance, as standing between the old and new cultures. His finest achievement is said to have been the deliberate construction of his own personality, in fact. Petrarch is largely responsible for centering human beings in the scheme of things. His program of humanistic studies became especially popular with the wealthy oligarchy that dominated political life in Florence. The Florentine chancellor Coluccio Salutate and a generation of young intellectuals who formed his circle evolved an ideology of civic humanism. Civic humanists wrote letters, orations, and histories praising their city's classical virtues and history. In the process, they gave a practical and public meaning to the Petrarchan program. Civic humanists argued, like Cicero himself, that there was a moral and ethical value intrinsic to public life. In a letter to a friend, Coluccio Salutati wrote that public life is something holy and holier than idleness in religious solitude. More than Petrarch himself, civic humanists viewed their task as the creation of men of virtue who could take the lead in government and protect their fellow citizens from lawlessness and tyranny. One of the most famous of these early humanists is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He was an intimate friend of Lorenzo de' Medici and a companion of Platonic scholar Marsilio Ficino. He was precociously brilliant and bragged that he'd read every book in Italy. He mastered Greek and Latin texts. He studied medieval Aristotelianism at the University of Paris and learned Arabic and the Islamic tradition. He was the first Christian of his day to take an interest in Hebrew culture. Pico also learned Hebrew and Aramaic and studied the Talmud with Jewish scholars. He was convinced that all human learning could be synthesized to yield basic and elementary truths. And at only 20 years of age, he proposed to defend at Rome his 900 theses, or intellectual propositions, which he claimed summed up all current learning and speculation. Church leaders didn't respond very well, and they attacked some of these theses as unorthodox, and he left Rome without a debate being held. But Pico della Mirandola is very important for his oration on the dignity of man, written in 1486. It's the preface to his 900 Theses. It's often cited as the first and most important document of Renaissance humanism. It is the most eloquent expression of the humanist respect for human dignity and the freedom to choose one's destiny. In fact, the central thesis of his oration on the dignity of man is that humanity stands at the apex of creation in such a way as to create the link between the world of God and that of creation. That is, man has the freedom to shape his own life. In fact, Pico has God say to man, "We have made you a creature such that you may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. Man, therefore, is even above the angels because he has free will. This is an amazing shift in the attitude toward human beings from the predestinarian stuff of Augustine that characterized the Middle Ages. Now, scholars do disagree on Pico's originality as a thinker, kind of like the 900 Theses are kind of a hodgepodge of knowledge without any genuine synthesis, but all scholars agree about his immense ability as a student of languages and culture to open new fields of study, thus contributing to the enthusiasm for learning in his own day. Another important humanist is Marsilio Ficino, whose dates are 1433 to 1499. He had an interest in Plato, and he shifts that interest to Plato and the ideal of the contemplative life. Cosimo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence from 1424 to 1464, was an astute banker and highly cultivated man of letters. His closest friends were professional humanists, collectors of books, and patrons of the arts. He himself spent vast sums on collecting and copying the ancient manuscripts. His most significant contribution to the advancement of Greek studies was the foundation and endowment of an academy for the study of Plato. They embraced Plato's ideas of striving for the ideal good and persistently searching for truth and beauty. The atmosphere was semi-religious. The disciples sang hymns praising Plato, burned a lamp before his bust, and adopted as their motto, salvation in Plato. For years, Cosimo and his heirs supported a priest, Marsilio Ficino, in order to allow him to translate and comment on the works of Plato. Ficino would translate all of Plato into Latin, as well as Plotinus and other Platonic thinkers. Plato had been known almost exclusively through a Latin translation of the Timaeus, and was to become a force in Western thought only as a result of Ficino's translation of Greek dialogues, hitherto inaccessible and in any event unreadable until linguistic difficulties were overcome. Ficino initiated a phase of intellectual history in which Platonic thought, interpreted largely through later mystics as Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus, was to combat the dominant Aristotelianism. Ficino really attempted to synthesize Christianity and Plato, as Aquinas had done with Aristotle, in a work entitled The Platonic Theology. In fact, Ficino coined the term Platonic love, the spiritual bond between two persons who were joined together in a contemplative search for true, the good, and the beautiful. So it's not like we use it today. You know, when you use the word Platonic love today, it just means, well, we're not doing it, right? But he was talking about sort of a bond between people searching for truth. So he definitely is stressing an emphasis on restoring the ancient text, which sharpened the development of the science of philology. They grew out of the interest since Petrarch in restoring the works of antiquity. Ficino and his followers stressed the uniqueness of mankind, including personal worth and dignity, as well as the power to transform oneself spiritually by choosing the good. Above all, each person was free through one's sphere of action, was circumscribed by the stars. So this, again, is an important step in a new attitude called the modern worldview. And after 1453, what's important is after 1453, Byzantium had fallen to the Muslims, and a bunch of Christian scholars had tons of Plato's works under their arms as they fled. And this is the stuff that Ficino and the Platonic Academy are going to be able to translate, and why Plato's going to have a big influence on the world. In fact, Plato's emphasis on reason and that you can't trust your senses really is going to help people accept that the world is round and not the center of the universe like it appears. You know, it appears that the sun is revolving around the earth to your eyes and your basic, the popular physics. But when Copernicus says that's not the case, the fact that this Platonic ideal of not trusting your senses is going to help people accept the fact that the earth is not the center of the universe, and in fact, it's just another planet rotating around the sun. Another important humanist is Lorenzo Valla, who was educated as a classicist, and he proved the document verifying the donation of Constantine, which the popes based their temporal authority on, was a forgery. In other words, the donation of Constantine was a forged document that supposedly the emperor Constantine had given the church their temporal authority over the Vatican territory in Rome, the Papal States. But so Valla first showed a truly critical spirit by demonstrating that this was a forgery. Now, I want to finish up with two civic humanists. Finally, the civic humanists will respond to the humanist movement with suggestions concerning a new politics for the world of turmoil in which they lived. Both Castiglione and Machiavelli recommend guile, indirection, and the appearance of probity where candor is impossible. The prince and the courtier both inhabit a world of uncertainty, danger, and shifting realities where the individual who best employs his intellect for self-protection is most likely to succeed. Italy had long been home to political disruptions, and these had not before inspired such caution. What was new was that Italy had entered a new age. Machiavelli and Castiglione wrote during the same period of crisis when Italy lay prey to the armies of Spain, France, and the Empire, and daily suffered devastation to people, to property, and to political autonomy. Machiavelli's response was to call for a native prince to save Italy from the barbarians who were plundering its liberty. Castiglione's was to accept the new limitations of power. Princes ruled everywhere. The prudent man learned how to please them. Now, Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier was written for the cultured nobility at the court of Urbino. It was deliberately limited in scope as a guide for aristocrats in service of their prince. The ideal ruler is described as a Renaissance man, equally talented and skillful on the battlefield and at court. In fact, the ideal courtier was a l'uomo universale, the universal man, a well-rounded person, one with humanist learning, impeccable ethics, refined courtesy, physical and mental skills, sort of expressed a sprezzatura, an effortless mastery, and also was a fascinating conversationalist. So you basically have the concept of the Renaissance man here in the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. This was the forerunner to modern books of etiquette. It became immensely influential throughout Europe and was still widely consulted as a guide to aristocratic bearing in the 18th century. We'll have other people writing books of etiquette after this, and it'll be a way for the aristocrats to separate themselves culturally from the common man. Now, Niccolò Machiavelli has been extremely important and influential up to modern times. Machiavelli, in fact, is the first major modern political thinker because he was the first to write political science from empirical data. He appeals to the lessons from history. That is, he didn't go back to history for moral lessons like they did in the Middle Ages, but for cause effects. This represents the new historical consciousness of the Renaissance. His most influential book, The Prince, was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici, the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. It reflects the sober realism of a middle-aged diplomat. He wanted to prod the Medici into embracing an ethic of power shorn of religion and ethical limitations as the only means of achieving a stable, secure Italy free of barbarian intervention. It would be too scandalous to be published during his lifetime, and it will be put on the Index of Prohibited Books by the Roman Catholic Church. So here he proposes the idea of the state as the creation of God and a ruler is responsible to God is an outdated medieval view. He rejects the humanist belief that human nature is essentially good and that individuals, given an opportunity, will naturally be helpful and honorable. In fact, Machiavelli holds to the contrary view, that individuals are much more likely to respond to fear and that power rather than the arts of rhetoric make for good government. In fact, in this book, he worked out a calculus of risks. Avoid needless cruelty, just enough to maintain the state in its power. So you don't want to be too cruel, but you want to be cruel enough so that they fear you. Because if they just love you, if an enemy comes, they're not likely to obey you very quickly to prepare for the enemy. But if they fear you, they will. Religion for Machiavelli is not a foundation for politics, but can be useful as a tool in the prince's struggle for success. So, be deceitful and cunning in dealing with rivals. Do as people actually do rather than as they ought to do. Regard the prince, the state, as supreme, recognizing that the end justifies the means. Always place military security first. Avoid neutrality, especially in dealing with other states. Instill fear in one's subjects as the best means to compel obedience. Undertake great enterprises to divert attention from internal problems. Such was the culture of power, and in espousing it, Machiavelli broke with the traditional model of the good ruler, whether Aristotelian or Judeo-Christian. This represents a handbook for new diplomacy. It will be highly influential with every autocratic ruler in the modern world. As Machiavelli surveyed history, he concluded that it was shaped by a recurring cycle of events instead of evolution and progress. Humanists have rejected a medieval view of history as merely the unfolding of God's will and providence. Instead, they stress the role of human actions and human wills in history, men as shapers of their destiny. So humanists now accepted the cyclical view of history of the ancients, like Aristotle, Polybius, Cicero. History alternates for them now between times of darkness and light, ignorance and illumination, decline and rebirth. They see the Middle Ages as a period of darkness between their own time and classical antiquity. And this is where we get the concept of separating history into ancient, medieval, and modern. Now let's summarize the humanist contribution. First, the educational goals, as in today's liberal arts, are cultivation of the mind, both for individual happiness and for equipping a person to play a worthy role in society. This offered a stimulus in science and art. I mean, they felt scholasticism of the Middle Ages had failed, not just because its terms and Latin usage were barbarous, but also because it did not provide useful knowledge. The central goal of a humanist education was to develop the virtuous individual, one who would lead a moral, disciplined life, not only for personal enrichment, but also for the benefit of society. So the goals of humanist education were to develop various virtuous individuals, ones who would live moral and virtuous lives. And they searched the accurate texts from classical Greece and Rome, which were intended for the socially elite and not the commoners. I really like Vergerio's description of liberal studies. He said this: "We call those studies liberal which are worthy of a free man, those studies by which we attain and practice virtue and wisdom, that education which calls forth, trains, and develops those highest gifts of body and mind, which ennoble men, and which are rightly judged to rank next in dignity to virtue only. Amongst these studies I accord the first place to history, on grounds both of its attractiveness and of its utility." So they saw, again, history as allowing you to learn about human nature and to not make the same mistakes in the past. A second major contribution of the humanists was a reversal of the prevailing view of history from the Christian view of a simple unfolding of God's will and providence to a cyclical view, like Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero believed. Therefore, history alternates between times of darkness and light, ignorance and illumination, decline and rebirth. On the basis of this cyclical view, the humanists invented the notion of the Middle Ages as that period separating the ancient world from their own by a gulf of darkness. To the humanists, then, we owe this current, as I said, this current periodization of history into ancient, medieval, and modern. They also introduced the whole of Latin and Greek literature into the mainstream of Western thought. No longer were these texts just searched for something to support the Bible. They're looking to this literature for lessons and understanding of the world itself. Finally, they developed critical tools, methods like paleography and textual criticism that would advance the fields of historiography and philology. Paleography is a study of ancient writing, so when they look at ancient texts that they found, that helps them date the text by the style of writing. And then textual criticism, where they actually look at the text themselves and the context that it's written in, and the culture it was written in. All these things sort of help us understand even more these ancient texts.